I read the first ever Gothic novel so that you don't have to. The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole is considered the first ever entry into the life of Gothic literature. But would it be considered a Gothic novel by today's standards? And if so, is it even worth reading? Well, spoiler alert, this book is hot garbage. I gave a review of it in my August reading wrap-up, so this will probably come as no surprise to most readers. I think the main issue is that Walpole attempts for like a recovered old manuscript kind of vibe, and he wrote the Castle of Otranto to be intentionally archaic and strange. This first edition got rave reviews at the time, and people thought he did an excellent job translating this work and preserving history. It went so well, he did a second edition, and this is where he came out and admitted that the work was not actually a newly discovered manuscript, it was something that he had fictionalized from the start, and the story was trashed. It's hard to say whether or not the Castle of Otranto got poor reviews at the time because there was a conception that literature should reflect the natural world, which was like changing to involve more experimental views, supernatural, flights of fantasy that we see in both the Romantic and Gothic movement, or if it got reviewed poorly because this had always been bad and we had just been excited to discover new history originally, and now we don't care about this crap anymore. Whether we'd still consider the Castle of Otranto Gothic is a whole separate matter, and it's something we plan to dive in further today. We're gonna go ahead and look at the 9 elements that might make something Gothic on this channel. We only need to find 3 in the Castle of Otranto for this to qualify. Starting with the horror elements. No, Castle of Otranto is not a scary novel. I can't say whether or not people have historically found this novel scary. There is this element of like prophecy that foretells demise, which I suppose could be scary to people. And there's also like this ghost of an ancestor that comes out of a portrait and seems to be haunting Manfred. I see a lot of potential for gothy goodness in that, and also like a lot of potential for really creepy, intense scares. I love someone who has a negative prophecy about them trying to defy it. I also love something like a portrait of Dorian Gray or like an ancestor coming back to either haunt you or help you. Maybe because this is the first time they're taking ghosts seriously and doing that kind of thing again. This just is confused and mushy and doesn't really commit to anything. 2. Character is king. Again, I'd have to pass on this particular Gothic element. I feel like all of the characters are very flat and one note. Manfred is evil and diabolical, possibly going a little bit loopy, and that's all he is. His daughter is super sweet and innocent. Hippolyta is the goodest of good girls. Number 3, more poetic prose. Regretfully, I'm gonna have to give this the check. That archaic, terrible language was obviously done with intention, partially for storytelling purposes. Just because I hate it, just because it's awful and makes the story drudgery and misery and just the worst, doesn't mean that it's not a form of stylistic, poetic choice intentionally meant to tell and enhance the story in a specific way. I just don't think it's a good thing. Number 4, elements of loneliness and longing. I don't think the Castle of Otranto intentionally implemented elements of loneliness and longing. Arguably, there are some elements with the text because this is a little kingdom that's isolated from everywhere else in the world. Manfred is allowed to sort of like rule as a tyrant and very few people can interfere with him. Everybody else is sort of like subject to his whims and feels like isolated and alone in the world. Also, these characters are all terrible communicators. It doesn't seem like they have any peers or anyone else they can relate to. Kind of like leaves them off on their own trying to figure stuff out. But it's never like thematically relevant within the text. I don't even know if it was intentional or if this is something that like as a modern reader I'm bringing to the text as someone who's like, oh, that's gotta be lonely and isolating, when maybe they didn't feel that way at a time period where communication and travel were a little bit more limited. Number 5, delving into elements of human mortality. This one, I guess, is technically yes. There is a prophecy that Manfred's line is going to end with him. He is very obsessed with getting his young son married so that he can have children and the line can continue despite this prophecy. So that question of legacy and a continued family line is relevant. Number 6, a supernatural element. Again, this is, yes, like I said before, there is a ghost that sort of wanders around. He does not do anything, he doesn't interact, and that was a waste of potential. There's also like this helm that appears and disappears, never explained, and it's definitely some kind of like magical, potentially sorcery related element. There's also prophecy going on, and prophecies are always magical in some kind of nature. Even though I don't like how these supernatural elements are presented, I think they're sort of like half-baked. There is a reason for this in the lore of the story's creation, and that's that Horace Walpole like had a dream about this helm that like expanded and contracted. So a lot of these like here 1 minute, gone the next sort of moments sort of makes sense when you realize that all of the stories sort of sprung up from this man's dream. Number 7, questioning a character's mental health. Very briefly, Manfred sort of questions his own mental health because he's been seeing the ghost of his dead grandfather. He comes into a room, he mistakes this youth for that ghost and like says that out loud and sort of like embarrasses himself or otherwise admits that he might be losing track of what's real and what's not. For the purposes of this review, I am checking this off as a no for questioning mental health in reality because it's like a paragraph and it's just like Manfred being embarrassed more than him actually questioning his own mental health in reality. So I just don't feel like this is the sort of tension about is he going mad or is it something supernatural that I'm looking for in a goth novel. Number 8, makes use of local folklore and legend. Again, I'm gonna say no. There is some sort of color about like the local area and legends and the Crusades and all this other stuff. And like the castle is built in a specific way with like this maze thing going on that I guess could have a legend or something that goes with it. I'm looking for like this sense of history and tracing it back through time. This piece of literature was meant to be something that they had found, like a relic. The manuscript itself was supposed to be the connection to like that bygone era. And it's not really feeding me within the story elements of that sense of like history and depth that you get from using local folklore and superstition. And then number 9, strong sense of place. While I could picture some of the rooms and some of the elements of the castle and the land surrounding it, I'm not going to give this the Gothic point. It's not the kind of sense of place where I felt like the castle took on a life of its own. It didn't become its own character with wants and desires, and none of the other locations that happen in the story become that either. So closing arguments. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you feel, the Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole does still qualify as a Gothic work. It hits 3 of those 9 points that it needs to qualify. That said, I don't think this is a great work of Gothic literature. You can see some of the beginnings of what later makes the Gothic movement great. There's this intense angst where like this grandfather ghost, even though they don't utilize it this way, it's sort of like sins of the father being revisited upon the son, which especially if the son is like wonderful, which is not the case for Manfred but is in a lot of these other Gothic works, there's some tension between those two things. Like, is it just, even if it's not just, is it just something that people have to deal with? Like, you have to face your family's history or your society's history and make amends or somehow appease this greater force than yourself to continue to live well. And you can see like all these different supernatural elements, the fact that the castle does have like some particularities, even though it doesn't 100% go into hauntings or 100% go back to like how the castle was built and like some tragic history or whatever. It starts to set up that idea and aesthetic there that you'll see in later on works. Even like some of the introspection and elements of tragic love or lost love, all of that is here in the Castle of Otranto, and later works are going to build on this and make it great. Do I think you need to read this book? No. Definitely not. This is not a good book by anyone's standard, but it does have the seeds of a lot of whimsical and interesting ideas that will flower later in the Gothic movement. Thank you guys for watching this video. If you've gotten this far, go ahead and leave me a black rose or like a statue emoji in those comments down below. And if you've read The Castle of Otranto, let me know what you thought about it in those comments down below. And as always, keep reading. Bye.